On January 5, 1943, as the sun began to rise over the waters off Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery aboard the light cruiser USS Helena, observed 4 Japanese Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers breaking through the morning haze. Their distinct silhouettes, with fixed landing gear, were unmistakable against the brightening sky. One bomber struck the New Zealand cruiser Achilles before the group turned away to escape. Standard procedure would have been to let them go, as they were already pulling away at 300 mph, climbing steeply. This presented a crossing shot that usually required an average of 2,500 rounds to score a single hit. However, Cochran's guns were not loaded with standard ammunition. His crew quickly loaded 3 rounds into the breeches, shells that on the outside appeared to be like any other 5-inch shell in the Pacific Fleet, but held something inside that would forever change naval warfare. The first 2 shells were fired, screaming through the air at 2,600 feet per second. They didn't hit the retreating bomber, but they didn't need to. 15 feet from the aircraft, something extraordinary happened. The shells, sensing the metal fuselage of the aircraft racing past, detonated on their own. The Val disintegrated in a burst of shrapnel and fire, with the crew having no idea what had just happened. Neither did the Japanese high command, as what had just occurred should not have been possible. A 5-inch artillery shell was far too small to contain the electronics necessary to detect a target. The shock of firing a shell generated 20,000 times the force of gravity, enough to destroy any radio or detection system. There were no miniature vacuum tubes that could survive such acceleration. Except there were, and they were about to transform America's anti-aircraft defenses into a weapon so powerful that Japanese pilots would begin flying one-way missions, knowing their conventional attacks were doomed to failure. This is the story of the proximity fuse, the billion-dollar secret that saved more American lives than almost any other invention of World War II, and the scientists who created something the enemy thought was science fiction. The need for this innovation grew from the attacks on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. On that fateful morning, the USS Helena was struck by a torpedo, one of many ships damaged or destroyed by Japanese aircraft that attacked with deadly precision. As shipwrights patched the 18-foot hole in her hull over the following months, naval analysts focused on a far deeper problem, one that no amount of welding could fix. American anti-aircraft gunnery was horribly ineffective. The numbers were unforgiving. Against a maneuvering aircraft at combat speeds, a 5-inch 38 caliber gun, the Navy's primary anti-aircraft weapon, required an average of 2,500 rounds to score a single kill. These 2,500 shells, each weighing 55 pounds and costing $18 to manufacture, represented a staggering cost of $45,000 to destroy a single aircraft, assuming perfect logistics and unlimited time to fire. Neither of these existed in combat. The core issue lay in physics. The speed of a moving aircraft presented a massive challenge. A 5-inch shell, traveling at 2,600 feet per second, needed 4.6 seconds to cover an engagement distance of 4,000 yards. In those 4.6 seconds, the aircraft would have moved over 2,000 feet, making it virtually impossible for gunners to aim accurately. They aimed at where the aircraft was, but by the time the shell arrived, the target had already moved. The result was empty air between the aircraft and the shell. There were 2 potential solutions. Contact fuses required a direct hit, threading a 55-pound projectile through the air to meet a moving target, a virtually impossible task. Time fuses required gunners to calculate precisely when a shell would reach the target's future position, set a mechanical timer by hand, and hope their calculations were accurate. If they were off by even half a second, the shell exploded far from the target, scattering shrapnel uselessly through empty sky. Both methods failed consistently, allowing Japanese aircraft to press their attacks, knowing the odds were in their favor. American ships were lost because their guns couldn't fight back effectively. The British were the first to identify the problem. By 1939, as war raged in Europe, researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment explored a solution that seemed to defy belief. Could a shell be built that knew when it was near a target? Samuel Curran, William Buttman, and their colleagues tested various detection methods, including optical systems using reflected light, acoustic systems listening for engine noise, magnetic systems sensing metal capacitive effects, and detecting changes in electrical fields. Every method ran into the same problem. The electronics needed to detect and trigger detonation were too large, too fragile, and too complex to survive being fired from a gun. The shock of acceleration would destroy any delicate components. The spinning of the rifled barrels at 25,000 revolutions per minute would tear them apart. Moisture would infiltrate circuits. The technology seemed impossible. Although British researchers made strides with proximity fuses for bombs and rockets, projectiles fired from guns remained out of reach. When the teasered mission arrived in the United States in September 1940, bringing Britain's most sensitive technologies, including cavity magnetron radar designs, they also shared their research on proximity fuses. Their message was clear. The concept could work in theory, but building a gun-fired version during the war might be impossible. The U.S. Navy, however, didn't accept the idea of impossibility. In June 1940, Vannevar Bush, the director of the newly created National Defense Research Committee, asked each service branch for solutions to this problem. The Navy's most urgent technical need took priority. Their request was simple yet extraordinary. Give us a proximity fuse that works with 5-inch shells. Everything else was secondary. The task was handed to Section T of the NDRC's Division 4, a team of physicists, engineers, and ordnance specialists led by Dr. Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Tuve, a 40-year-old physicist who had pioneered radar research in the 1930s, knew the challenge they were facing. They were being asked to miniaturize an entire radio transmitter receiver system into the size of a pint milk bottle. It had to survive 20,000 G-forces, function in temperatures ranging from 100 degrees to 50 below zero, and continue working after violent acceleration and spinning. The fuse had to be built with safety mechanisms to prevent accidental detonation in storage or to avoid harming friendly aircraft. A self-destruct feature was necessary to prevent the enemy from capturing it. Additionally, it had to be mass-produced by the millions. The timeline was impossible, and the technical obstacles seemed insurmountable. Failure would mean continued losses for American sailors. But success would forever change aerial warfare. Dr. James Van Allen, who would later discover Earth's radiation belts, joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in early 1942. This laboratory was specifically set up to oversee proximity fuse development, and it was housed secretly at Johns Hopkins University, so much so that even the university's board of trustees was kept in the dark about the military contract's true purpose. Van Allen's role was to develop vacuum tubes capable of surviving being fired from a gun. The challenge seemed straightforward until one understood the forces at play. A 5-inch shell, when fired, accelerated from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in the length of the 20-foot gun barrel. This acceleration created forces exceeding 20,000 Gs. A vacuum tube weighing just 1 ounce would experience pressures equivalent to 200 pounds trying to crush it. The glass envelopes shattered, the filaments snapped, and the internal components failed. Standard radio tubes disintegrated instantly. Van Allen and his team began with miniature vacuum tubes designed for hearing aids, the smallest commercially available vacuum tubes. Western Electric and Rathon provided initial samples. These tubes were smaller than a thumb, delicate glass cylinders housing metal filaments and grids spaced by thousandths of an inch. The team built special test fixtures that simulated the shock of a gun firing, using compressed air to accelerate the tubes at extreme G-forces. Every test ended in broken glass and destroyed components. After months of trial and error, they redesigned the tube's internal structure, shortened its elements to reduce bending, used thicker filament wire to prevent snapping under stress, and chose stronger glass to resist shattering. They also filled the tubes with special mounting compounds to cushion the internal parts. Each modification meant building new tubes, testing them, analyzing failures, and trying again. Hundreds of design iterations failed, but the Navy continued to fund the project, understanding that failure meant further losses in the Pacific. By January 1942, the team had developed a prototype vacuum tube that survived test firing. The T3 fuse, designed around these rugged miniature tubes, was ready for its first real test in August. The light cruiser USS Cleveland, fresh off commissioning and conducting shakedown trials in Chesapeake Bay, loaded proximity-fused shells into her 5-inch batteries for evaluation. The test was scheduled to last 2 days. Navy observers expected hundreds of rounds to be fired to assess the fuse's effectiveness. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drones, small aircraft flown remotely at various speeds and altitudes. Cleveland's gunners fired at the first drone, and within moments, the drone was destroyed. The second drone tried evasive maneuvers, but the gunners tracked it smoothly and destroyed it too. The third drone had no chance. The Navy cancelled the rest commander William Parsons. The Navy ordnance specialist who oversaw the first shipment of proximity fuses to the Pacific would later be tasked with arming the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay for the Hiroshima mission. In early January 1943, he watched as the crew of the USS Helena loaded the newly developed ammunition and awaited the combat test of what had been promised by the laboratories. The test came on the morning of January 5th, when 4 Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers appeared. Lieutenant Red Cochrane's gunners fired the new shells as designed. Each shell's radio transmitter emitted pulses at 220 megahertz, and as the pulse reflected off the aircraft, the fuse detected the Doppler shift in frequency caused by the approaching target. At exactly 15 feet from the plane, when the returning signal reached a set threshold, a tiny amplifier circuit triggered a detonator that ignited the 7 pounds of high explosives in the shell. The resulting explosion enveloped the bomber in a deadly sphere of shrapnel traveling at thousands of feet per second. The bomber disintegrated mid-air, reduced to debris in an instant. The other 3 bombers managed to escape that day, but the technology had been proven in combat. The fuse that shouldn't have existed had just claimed its first victim. The impact was immediate and measurable. In 1943, the Navy fired 36 Sound 370 anti-aircraft rounds. Only 25% of these used proximity fuses, but those 25% accounted for 51% of all aircraft kills. The proximity fuse was 3 to 4 times more effective than traditional ammunition. A proximity-fused shell's lethal fragment area spanned 3,000 square feet, compared to the 60 square feet of a time-fused shell. One analysis estimated that 278 Japanese aircraft were destroyed by proximity fuses between 1943 and the end of the war. Had conventional ammunition been used, only 46 of those aircraft would have been shot down. That difference, over 200 aircraft prevented from reaching their targets, meant the survival of American ships and the lives of American sailors. As production ramped up throughout 1943 and into 1944, proximity fuses became standard equipment across the Pacific Fleet. By the end of 1943, production reached 40,000 fuses per day, and by the war's end, 70,000 were being made daily. More than 22 million fuses were produced, involving over 100 companies and 80,000 workers. The scale of American industrial production was enormous, and the technology proved itself repeatedly in the desperate naval battles of 1944 and 1945. When Japanese forces began launching kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses became the primary defense against aircraft whose pilots were willing to die to complete their mission. Conventional ammunition struggled against kamikazes because pilots flew directly through defensive fire, often willing to absorb damage to keep control of their planes long enough to reach their target. Proximity fuses didn't require destroying the aircraft or killing the pilot. They simply needed to detonate near enough to break the aircraft into pieces too small to reach their target. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitcher during the fast carrier task forces, witnessed the fuse's effectiveness firsthand. Years later, he stated flatly that without proximity fuses, American ship losses and casualties during the final stages of the Pacific War would have been much higher. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal called them indispensable, attributing much of the success of the westward push across the Pacific to the protection provided by proximity fuses. On May 11, 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, a group of American destroyers and landing craft faced a 90-minute attack from 156 Japanese aircraft on one-way missions. The USS Hadley and USS Evans, both equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, shot down 35 confirmed enemy planes before sustaining multiple hits and being forced to withdraw. The official Navy report declared the fuses indispensable for survival, stating that without them, both ships would have been lost in the first minutes of the attack. The Pentagon's strict prohibition on using proximity fuses over land remained in place throughout 1943 and most of 1944 due to the risk of a dud shell falling into enemy hands. The concern was that the Japanese could recover and reverse engineer the fuses, making their own versions. This would lead to catastrophic consequences for Allied bomber formations, and the strategic bombing campaign could collapse. However, when Germany launched its V-1 flying bomb campaign against London in June 1944, the situation changed. The V-1, a jet-powered cruise missile carrying nearly 2,000 pounds of explosives, flew at 400 mph at low altitudes, making it too fast for most conventional interceptors. British anti-aircraft batteries in a coastal strip aimed at protecting London faced the same issues that American ships had encountered. Traditional guns couldn't hit fast-moving small targets. On June 12, 1944, the US authorized the use of proximity fuses over England. Since the V-1s flew over water before reaching land, any dud shells would fall into the sea, where they posed no threat to the Germans. The results were dramatic. Between June 12th and the end of August, Germany launched 9 to 300 V-1s, averaging 120 per day. By the fourth week of using proximity fuses, anti-aircraft batteries were successfully stopping 79% of all incoming V-1s. The fuses had effectively saved London, and thousands of British civilians owed their lives to shells that exploded near the target, rather than directly hitting it. Winston Churchill, who had championed proximity fuse development from the British side, acknowledged their critical role in defending against the V-1s. The final test came in December 1944. When Germany launched the Battle of the Bulge on December 16th, General Dwight Eisenhower urgently requested permission to use proximity-fused artillery shells against German ground forces. The Pentagon hesitated. If a dud shell fell into enemy hands in the snow-covered Ardennes, the technology could be compromised. Eisenhower argued that his artillery commanders had been training with shells designed for airburst detonation over ground targets, which would explode at heights of 20 to 50 feet above the earth, showering troops and vehicles with shrapnel. Without these shells, he feared his forces might not be able to stop the German offensive. Permission came within 2 days. Colonel George Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group, did not wait for formal authorization. When the 38th Cavalry Squadron requested urgent fire support on the morning of December 16th, he ordered his gunners to load the new proximity fuse shells despite the restrictions. This decision likely prevented heavy casualties among American forces. Over 200,000 proximity-fused shells were used in the Battle of the Bulge and the Allied advance that followed. The effects were devastating for the German forces. Traditional artillery shells exploded on impact with the ground, leaving soldiers in foxholes or trenches with some protection. Proximity-fused shells, however, exploded in the air above them, offering no cover, no way to escape. The shrapnel rained down from above, finding soldiers who thought they were safe. German prisoners described the attacks as sudden, powerful bursts with no defense against them. Some soldiers even refused to move during American artillery barrages because they feared the overwhelming danger that awaited them. General George Patton praised the new shells, calling them devastating. In a report to the War Department, he described an incident where American forces stopped a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River, citing that 700 enemy soldiers were taken down. Patton later declared that the funny fuse had won the Battle of the Bulge. From the Battle of the Bulge to the crossing of the Rhine, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire brought down more than 1,000 German aircraft. Luftwaffe attacks, already weakening due to Allied air superiority, became much more hazardous when proximity-fused shells turned the sky above Allied positions into an impenetrable defensive zone. German pilots began to realize that something had changed. Captured prisoners described American artillery shells that exploded with precise timing above the ground. Luftwaffe pilots reported American ships whose anti-aircraft fire seemed unnaturally accurate. German intelligence officers collected reports but couldn't explain what they were hearing. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces overran an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity fuses. Although the Germans captured these shells intact and ready for use, they misidentified them as just-time fuses with sophisticated mechanisms. The idea that a radio transmitter receiver who could survive gunfire was so beyond their comprehension that they didn't recognize what they had. The Germans had researched proximity fuses in the late 1930s, developing designs that used electrostatic fields, acoustic triggers, and radio methods. Over 30 different designs were explored, but by 1940, Hitler's directive to focus all resources on the invasion of the Soviet Union forced German scientists to abandon these projects. They resumed their work on proximity fuses in 1945, but by then it was too late. The war ended before they could produce them in sufficient numbers. The technology that Dr. Tuve's team developed under the NDRC represented more than just miniaturized radios in artillery shells. It symbolized an unprecedented collaboration between civilian and military scientists, a successful integration of British research, and a demonstration of American industrial might that could mass-produce highly complex technologies in record time. At its peak, 3% of all physicists in the United States worked on the Proximity Fuse project. The total cost exceeded $1 billion, which is equivalent to over $15 billion today. The Proximity Fuse project was considered just as critical to victory as the Manhattan Project. Both projects operated under the strictest secrecy and succeeded because failure was simply not an option. The legacy of the proximity fuse stretches far beyond World War II. Modern air defense systems, from ship-mounted Phalanx CIWS to the Patriot surface-to-air missile, all use proximity fuses as standard. Guided weapons, such as the Phoenix M54 air-to-air missile and SM-1, SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, all incorporate advancements from the technology pioneered by Van Allen and his colleagues. The core principle remains unchanged. Detect when you're near a target and detonate at the optimal distance for maximum effect. The execution has evolved beyond what those wartime engineers could have imagined. But the concept they proved possible under near impossible conditions is still fundamental to modern warfare. Lieutenant Cochrane, who fired those first 3 proximity fuse shells on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal, never knew exactly how his ammunition worked. He understood that the shells were special, that they worked differently from standard shells, and that discussing them could lead to a court-martial. He didn't know he was firing miniature radar sets, vacuum tubes that could survive 20,000 G-forces, electronics that functioned in a space smaller than a pint milk bottle, spinning at 25,000 RPM and surrounded by 7 pounds of high explosives. He just knew that his guns finally worked the way they were supposed to: point at the enemy, fire, and watch them fall. The simplicity of it was deceptive. Behind that simple effectiveness lay years of research, hundreds of failed prototypes, the mobilization of industries across 5 major manufacturers and over 100 subcontractors, 80,000 workers, and 3% of America's physicists. The proximity fuse took a seemingly impossible idea and turned it into a mass-produced reality. That transformation from impossible to routine is a testament to the incredible capability of American industry and science. The funny fuse, as Patton called it, turned anti-aircraft gunnery from a desperate hope into reliable lethality. It protected American ships across the Pacific, saved London from the V-1 attacks, decimated German forces during the Battle of the Bulge, and did all this without requiring gunners to directly hit their targets. The shell just needed to pass close enough for the tiny radar inside to say, "Now." And in that moment, lives were saved, and enemies were neutralized. The weapon that was once thought impossible proved to be one of the most effective and transformative technologies of the war.